Hello, and welcome to the Ohio Resource Center's Science Instructional Strategies, a look at the OGT webcast, and more specifically, building a test bank of OGT-like items. I'm Terry Shiverdecker, Science Content Specialist for the ORC. In this webcast, we will be discussing reasons to build a bank of OGT-like items, demonstrate a procedure for aligning items to standards and cognitive demand, and provide some sites where OGT-like items can be found. For those of you viewing live, you can participate in today's discussion with your email questions using the Submit a Question button to the right side of your screen. Submit your question early and we'll answer as many of them as we can at the end of the live program. You'll also find support materials related to today's topic, including the Building a Test Bank of OGT-like Items article and companion mini collections. These items can be accessed at any point without disrupting the webcast. You can also find information about other webcasts in the series on the Science Instructional Strategies, a look at the OGT webpage at www.ohiorc.org/4/science/OGT. Now I'd like to introduce our two panelists joining us for today's discussion on building a test bank of OGT-like items. Joining me today are Amanda Looney and Karen Bensman. Amanda is a 612 Science Curriculum Coordinator for the Columbus City School District. Prior to this, Amanda taught chemistry and physics at Beechcroft High School. She is currently pursuing her doctoral degree in the School of Policy and Leadership at The Ohio State University. Karen is a 712 science teacher at Russia Local School. She has her national board certification and serves as the District 5 Director for the Science Education Council of Ohio. Welcome, Amanda, Karen.
Thanks, Terry.
Thank you. The article talks about building a test bank of OGT items, and that's our topic for discussion today. Karen, can you tell me what some of the advantages of having a bank of OGT items are?
Well, we know that the OGT test really is an important test for our high school students. But as teachers and professionals, we find time is an issue. And so if we can go to a test bank items instead of trying to create our own all of the time, that's extremely helpful. Another thing is that sometimes we have our own areas of specialty. And so I am good at coming up with biology or life science type questions, but not so good about the earth science or the physical science. So here I get a good variety of questions if I develop my own bank. And sometimes I find that when I'm doing intervention, I really need to have items in an area that is maybe not my specialty. And so I run out of items much more quickly. And so if I have a good test bank, or if I've gone to some of the places that we'll talk about later, I can get a good variety of questions. Instead of just 5 questions, I might have 35 questions. That's very helpful if it's an area that's not my specialty.
Okay, great. Amanda, anything to add?
You want to also have a bank because you want to provide your students with multiple opportunities to interact with OGT-like items. You don't want your students waiting up until the day of the test where they actually get to interact with these type of items because students already have to deal with test anxiety. However, if you constantly provide them with opportunities to interact with these type of items throughout your instruction on a day-to-day basis, then you'll help students feel more successful, or actually help them feel more confident in their abilities to be successful on the test.
Okay, great. So a bank of OGT-like items is beneficial for the teacher and for the student.
Yes.
Okay, great. Amanda, can you talk briefly about the process you've described for analyzing OGT-like items?
Yes. If you were to take a look at the alignment guide that's provided in the article, it goes through like a series of steps or things that the teacher needs to identify when looking at an item and determining its alignment. The first thing that's mentioned in that alignment guide is you have to identify the topic of the item. And when I say topic, I'm not talking about the narrow topic or the small topic. I'm talking about the broader or the bigger ideas in science. For example, in physical science, your bigger ideas would be matter and energy, whereas a more narrow topic would be something like kinetic energy. You're getting really specific. So when you're looking at the topic, you want to look at the broader ideas. Then after you have identified the topic, then from that topic, then you're going to know, kind of be geared towards which standard does this address. Obviously in physical science, there are specific standards that are addressed. Life science, there's certain standards. So your topic is really going to gear you towards the next step of identifying your standard. And then after that, then you start narrowing it down to the actual benchmark level. The benchmark level, again, go back to your topic, and then you're going to try to, because you've identified your topic broadly, you're going to go through those various benchmarks within the standard to identify what specific benchmark does this particular item address. And then the last step is you want to identify the cognitive demand of the item, because you want to ensure that, you know, is this item giving the students the same rigor that's provided on the actual OGT test.
Okay. Karen, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I think it's important for us today to look at the 4 areas of cognitive demand, because if we're asking you to identify that on a question, we should know what that is. And so on your screen you see these. Recalling and identifying accurate science. We want to know, how well does the student know science? Can they recall and identify accurate facts? Can they describe science concepts or connect ideas to prior science learning? Can they recognize and discuss scientific relationships in scientific systems? And so that is recalling or identifying. But we want to make sure we go above and beyond that. So we look at communicating, understanding, or analyzing information. And that question is, how well does the student communicate their thinking about scientific information? Can they organize ideas? Can they provide accurate data in forms of tables and charts? They're not providing it necessarily, but can they understand it when they see it? Can they support their conclusions through evidence that have been given on the questions? Can they identify trends and patterns on any graph or any table? So that's analyzing the information. The third one is demonstrating investigation or the process of science. And the question you might ask on this one is, how well do you show that you can plan and do meaningful scientific investigations? So in this, you use questions that can be scientifically investigated, and maybe by guided inquiry. Suggest methods, tools, variables that are going to give controls. So do we know the control of the scientific experiment? These are the things that the kids are being asked to do. Make predictions based on discoveries. Formulating future questions for investigation based on the discoveries that you have in the question. And finally, can we apply concepts or make relevant connections with science? The students must demonstrate an understanding of scientific applications for this. The question is, or the question that you might ask to determine this cognitive level is, how well do you show application of science and how it connects to individuals in society? In here, is it going to be a societal issue? Is it going to be a scientific issue? Can we apply this concept? Can we suggest alternatives? We, again, meaning the students. Can they use technology and understand the scientific principles of that technology? Again, we want to analyze this information and then apply the information. So those are the 4 levels that we're going to be looking at when we talk about cognitive demand.
Yeah, and that cognitive demand really is important, and that summary of the 4 different cognitive demands I think is particularly helpful. Now, Amanda, I have to tell you that I'm really excited about this process that you've developed. I think it's very useful to teachers. So why don't you take us through this and apply that process to an OGT-like item?
Sure. Okay, looking at the item that's on your screen, if you read the question, it says, the freezing point of a liquid is the temperature at which a liquid changes to a solid. The table below lists the freezing point for liquids. So the first thing that you would want to do, Terry, is you would want to look at this item and determine what topic does it address. Keywords in this item: freezing point, temperature, change. That lets you know that you're dealing with matter or properties of matter. Then from there you would say, okay, once I know the topic, then what standard does this address? And because matter is a concept that's dealt with in the physical sciences, then that is the particular standard that's being addressed for that item. The next step after that is you want to look at, okay, which benchmark is this addressing? And for this particular item, this item is addressing benchmark C, which shows on your screen, and it's benchmark C states, describe the identifiable physical properties of substances, for example, color, hardness, conductivity, density, concentration, ductility, and explain how in these properties can occur without changing the chemical nature of the substance. Now, one thing about if you were to refer back to the item, it doesn't explicitly state physical properties of substances. However, we do know that liquid changes and freezing point are considered a physical property. So this particular item more closely aligns with this benchmark. I will say a disclaimer to teachers, a lot of times when we look at items or when we look at the benchmarks when we're dealing with the standards, we assume that the grade level indicators tell us everything that we need to know about a particular benchmark. However, the benchmark is greater than that, and the GLIs only give us a certain snapshot of what's included in that benchmark. So we want to, when we're dealing with assessments or assessing our students in science, we want to focus on the broader ideas, looking at the benchmark and then all the other details that go along with that. The last step for this item is you would want to look at the item and say, okay, what is it asking the student to do? And in this case, this item will be aligned with the communicating, understanding, analyzing science information, because the item requires the student to interpret scientific information, and then it also requires them to draw a conclusion from that information.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. Karen, is there anything you'd like to add about this particular question or about the process?
I think there's one important thing that you can recognize from one of these questions, and that is that the question was, it gave you information and then it gave you a table. The question reads, which of the liquids in the table would be least likely to freeze outside during winter in Ohio? And it does give you the 4 choices from the table. So it is a multiple choice question. You can easily turn this into a written response question. It doesn't change the cognitive demand, it doesn't change the benchmark, it doesn't change anything. It just changes the response of the student. So I would just say, which is least likely to freeze outside during the winter in Ohio, and why? And then you get rid of the choices, and they have to write the question out. And we have to remember that OGT-like questions includes short answer and extended response questions. So you can take a question like this and switch it to one of those types of questions.
And I think it's important to point out that we do hear oftentimes, well, the students just have such a hard time writing and answering those short answer and extended response. So changing those questions is I think, a good strategy. And also the 4 cognitive demands can be presented as multiple choice or as short answer extended response, which I think is another important point. So we're talking about, we've got this great process, and we're talking about aligning these OGT-like items. Where do I find these OGT-like items? Amanda?
Well, the article points out several different resources in which you can find additional items in which you could align to make them OGT type items. The first resource is, of course, the Ohio 9th grade proficiency test, because that's where a lot of teachers are familiar with. We've used these items, we've seen these items, and these items can be accessed through the Ohio Department website. And on the website, you'll find full tests and release items for 2005 and 2006. Another place where you can actually locate items is the PISA release items for science, and this includes questions and scoring guides from the Program for International Student Assessment. Then another useful site that I find this site very beneficial, I use it a lot, is the Ed Informatics site, and this is where it provides you links to other release state tests, TIMS materials, and more. And I like this site in particular because the release state items, you find that most of our standards for all the states are aligned to the national standard. So although the wording may not be exactly the same, you can see similarities, and then you can look at those items to see how they assess things. And then finally, you want to look at the NAEP items that are available on the Ohio Resource Center website. These items are aligned to the content standards. However, they're not aligned in regards to cognitive level. And I'll point out that with any item that you use, you want to always ensure that, one, is it aligned to our content, and two, what is the rigor of this item? Because sometimes unfortunately, you will find items where it's aligned to the content. However, the cognitive demand is not the same that's required in Ohio.
Okay, so again, pay close attention to that cognitive demand and to the content. Karen, do you have some additional suggestions for places we can find OGT-like items?
Yes, Amanda did talk about the 9th grade proficiency that has been released, but also some of the old OGT tests have been released. And again, you can go to the ODE website and actually get the previous OGT tests for the last couple years. And as we know, we have a lot of educational companies out there, including textbook companies, and many of these companies are coming up with flashcards and practice tests and items that you can use. Once again, the same thing that Amanda said. Do make sure they align to Ohio standards, because most of these companies are not just targeting one state. And again, make sure they have the rigor that we need. We don't need to spend all of our questions and all of our energy on recall when we need to make sure that we are applying some of the concepts also. We want to hit all areas of cognitive demand.
Okay.
We also want to make sure, sorry, I had one more thing, that when we're looking at these questions, make sure that you do implement both multiple choice and written response. And I think students, even though they complain about written response, they do like the practice.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and I think, again, that make sure it's aligned. Just because somebody tells you it's aligned, particularly if they're selling you something, it's probably a good idea to verify that yourself. And again, we're talking about the content standards and cognitive demand and aligning these items. Karen, what should teachers be looking for in terms of the process standards as they're working towards building a bank of OGT-like items?
I think sometimes it's really easy for us to focus on questions that are areas that we're good at, but we can't forget the process standards, which are the scientific ways of knowing, scientific inquiry, and the science and technology. So whenever we're looking at any of the questions, and I don't care if they're old OGT questions or if they come from a completely different state, we do need to make sure that they are covering these processes. And again, as we've said, the cognitive areas have to be covered in a variety of ways. We don't want to spend all of our time on the lower levels. We do need to have our students applying the skills and making sure that they understand not just recall, but understand, analyze, demonstrate, show investigative qualities, and what are the relevant concepts to science, and how can I apply that to science? So I do want to have all of those areas covered. We do want to make sure that that happens.
Okay, great. Amanda, anything to add about process standards?
I would say from experience, the process standards are probably the more difficult ones to assess through traditional formats like paper and pencil. And I think, honestly, a lot of my colleagues will leave the process standards out. They'll focus strictly on the content. It's content, content, content. So I must say that when we talk about assessment, providing multiple assessment opportunities, something that I mentioned earlier, is that we need to look at assessment more broadly instead of the pencil paper format, because assessment can occur in multiple ways. And one thing that the process standards do focus on is getting kids to do science, actually doing it. And so in the case of science, then what more wonderful way to incorporate process standards or assess students' process standards is through laboratory activities. Perhaps you may have an OGT-like question in the context of their laboratory report. You want them to explain or identify or something in the context of what they're doing, because you want them to have familiarity with those processes, but you don't want it to be such in isolation that it's out of the content. They're just doing something, because you can't do something unless you have content to do it with. Mm-hmm. And for example, if you were to look at the item that's going to show on your screen from the 2007 March administration of the OGT, this particular item deals with Himalayan rabbits, and it asks the students to suppose the same scientist wanted a Himalayan rabbit with white feet. What procedure most likely generate these results? This particular item is addressing the scientific inquiry standard benchmark A. And the thing about this item is that you would look at it and say, okay, it's just a process. It wants them to explain something. However, the students need to know some content in order to address this particular question, because you can't do a process unless you have some content to do it with. So if anything, I would say when addressing process skills, have them do it in conjunction with the content. So they're doing the science that they're learning.
Okay, good. So we want to assess those process skills regularly. We want to integrate those processes into the content, and we want to make sure we're assessing them at multiple cognitive demands. So, okay, great. Now we've talked about cognitive demand a lot. So, Karen, beyond preparing students for the OGT, which is of course our immediate concern, why is paying attention to cognitive demand so important?
I think that's a really good question, and I have to say that my students that come through on a daily basis are not all going to have science careers, but it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be good thinkers. We need to make sure that they understand how science works, what makes good science, and ultimately with that they make good scientific decisions when they go out, you know, and they lead their life. They're seeing information on the television, they read information in magazines or even articles in the newspaper, which are a lot of times just written by an editor who has no science background. And so we do need to make sure that our students are able to assess, analyze, and become good science consumers. You know, they are going to be running the country. When we're retiring, we hope they're making good decisions for us. And many of those are science decisions, but not all of those. So the test is immediate, but ultimately we want them to be good thinkers.
Okay. Amanda, would you like to add anything?
Yes, I would say, going along with what Karen was saying, a lot of times, and I hear this so much, when people speak of students, how the teenagers today, they can't think, or they're so focused on media that they don't have any thinking skills. They're not able to be critical about anything. And if anything, by addressing different cognitive demands, one of our jobs or one of our goals as educators is to be able to cultivate the minds of the future. So regardless, even though we hope every one of our students will become future scientists, we know the reality is that some will and some won't. So whatever they do in the future, we want them to be able to critically think about anything that they're doing, because in actuality, the process or the cognitive demands, those different things can be transferred to other disciplines, because you're applying things in other disciplines, you're analyzing things, you're communicating things in other disciplines. So ultimately, you know, you want the kids to be better thinkers.
Okay, very, very good. Good information. Well, let's turn to some email questions and see what additional information our audience would like. Okay, so this is a really good question. What is your suggestion for intervening with students who have failed the tests multiple times, especially if they are seniors and needing to pass the OGT as a graduation requirement?
Okay, I'll take that first, if you don't mind. When I do intervention with my students who need to pass this test, one of the first things that I do is go back and look at their scores and see what areas were they low in. If they were okay in life science, I'm going to touch on that a little bit in the intervention, but basically I want to focus in on the areas that they seem to have the most trouble with. And you can find that information. You might have to go to your administrative office, but you can get that information about every student. And you give them OGT-like items in that area, and then don't just give it to them and say, no, that's right or that's wrong. You say, this is why this is the right answer. This is why this is not the right answer. And use that to help develop their skills or content area, you know, whether it's an earth science question or a physical science question or a scientific inquiry question. None of those matter. I mean, all of those are important. I can go above and beyond just asking a question. The second thing that I would do is make sure they know how to write a written response. If it asks for 2 points and then an explanation, then you better give a point and an explanation, and a second point and an explanation. And they're very clear usually on those questions. And sometimes if you just give them a few test-taking skills, you might bump them up 2 or 3 points.
Yeah. So the test-taking strategies are important, but using these released OGT items and OGT-like items, those really can form a foundation for a conversation around the content.
Absolutely.
Okay. Amanda, did you have anything you wanted to add for that question?
Yeah, I would say, because this is one of my, I don't want to say struggles, but this is one of my challenges I have every day, is try to figure out how to get all the seniors in the Columbus City School District to pass the science test. The first thing that I would recommend is, I know ODE has the OGT Success Guide, and it's kind of like a guide that you and the student, you work out a plan depending upon how many days you have to the test on what things are you going to focus on between now and obviously March, because that's the next test. I would start with there. Going along with what Karen was saying as far as looking at the content in which they struggled with as based upon the data from previous tests. You want to go beyond just focusing on OGT items, looking at previous test items. Sometimes it actually may mean that you go and may have to teach or reteach some content that they otherwise did not get. And a lot of times in dialoguing with the students, as you were suggesting, during going over test questions, you could actually figure out, okay, maybe the students really quite didn't get this particular concept. I may actually need to teach them this for the first time. Spend some time doing that. Then also it's going to make a difference as whether or not the student actually has a science class or not. I know a lot of seniors in our district don't have science classes, so that makes an even bigger dilemma as far as how do we reach them. If you have a class with seniors, then try to provide different, whether it's question of the days, just different assessment opportunities in the context of instruction, outside the context of instruction. But if they don't have a science class, then that means that it's going to have to be a concerted effort to actually work with those kids and develop a time with the schedule to get them to pass the test.
Yeah. Excellent suggestions, and I know that is a concern for lots of teachers in lots of districts. How can I help this student succeed and graduate? Can the alignment guide mentioned in the article be used for test items that I develop and use in my classroom?
I would say that, to me, is like my ultimate goal of the purpose of the alignment guide, because I know from my own experience from making tests or assessments, I've maybe used the textbook resources, and sometimes they were aligned and sometimes they weren't. Sometimes those items only hit a certain cognitive level, which was usually recall. So my hope would be that teachers actually use the alignment guide when they're developing their assessment, so that the different benchmarks and standards are balanced, whatever ones they're addressing, and the cognitive level is balanced. So it's kind of like getting teachers to be critical about their practice themselves. To look at what they're doing and saying, okay, am I really providing my students with all the opportunities that I can to make them successful?
Okay. Karen, did you have anything you wanted to add to that particular question?
Just that it's doable. You know, sometimes we look at that and say, I don't think I can do that. But if we just do 2 items a week, you can do that. You can do 2 items a week.
Yeah, that's such wonderful advice from the two of you, and bringing that all home, that it's doable. It's not necessarily easy, but it's doable. Let's do one. I think one more question. How does it benefit students to incorporate assessment items from other states that may or may not have been written similarly to OGT items?
I'll take that first, if you don't mind. I was thinking, as we look at OGT test items, so often they give you a graph, they give you a table, they ask a question in a way that you might not have thought. And even if the test question itself doesn't align maybe to the way we want it, I now have a table, a series of pictures, whatever it might be. And many times it's easy to come up with a question that we can put in any one of those cognitive levels. if I have a picture or a graph, because as we know on the OGT, there are a lot of pictures and graphs and tables. And so using items from other states that might not necessarily align to us, we can get them to align, and they give us a lot of good ideas and a lot of good information.
Okay, and the stimulus, like you said, those are hard to come by. Amanda, anything to add?
No, I don't have anything to add.
Okay. I think that's all the questions we have time for now. Amanda and Karen, do you have any final key points that you'd like to make?
The thing I was thinking about, in preparing for this is the idea was having a good test bank of items. And one of the best things that we can do for our students is to give them practice. They don't go in cold. I think it's important to note that the extended response questions are being written on a gridded response page. If they've never seen that before, they might think they're supposed to draw a graph or do a table or something on there. And so if they're prepared and they go in with that, then we don't have any real big issues about they didn't know how to answer the question. So practice with these items, and it really takes care of some of that test anxiety.
Okay, good. And Amanda, I'm going to ask you for final points in a moment, but I did just get another question, and I know I said no more, but when a really good question comes across the desk, we've got a wonderful opportunity here. So how do you deal with students with IEPs? Are there any special strategies that can enhance their experience?
Well, I would say, in regards to, if I'm clear, when looking at students with IEPs, you want to, whenever you're doing assessments in your classroom or assessment opportunities, you want to provide the same, whatever their accommodations are, you want to provide the same type of accommodations during those assessment opportunities. I know the different accommodations, because you want them to get used to that. So for example, I know sometimes some accommodations may be that they're allowed to have items read to them, or they're allowed to use calculators, or so you want to, when you're giving your regular ed students those different assessment items, then you want to allow your students with accommodations to be able to do their accommodations with those assessment items, so that they're familiar with the process also in the context in which they'll be actually experiencing when they take the test.
So if the student's allowed to have a reader or a scribe,
right,
that should be incorporated into the daily or the regular assessment that's taking place in the classroom.
And you want to do it in a way so that it benefits all students, and it's not putting those students like in the spotlight. So you may, like if the student needs a reader, you may actually just say, okay, I want you guys to work in pairs to go over this assessment item in a group, so that you're really making those accommodations that you're making for the students with the IEP for everybody. So, because honestly, everybody would benefit from those accommodations. So that's my suggestion.
Okay. Karen, do you have anything to add?
I was just thinking along the same lines. Try whatever is on the IEP that they get for any help that they're going to get the test day. Try to make sure that you're providing that for them also, because it reduces their anxiety. And sometimes reduced anxiety gets you a few more points.
Yeah, right. And if you can, anything we can do to help kids feel comfortable with this and alleviate some of that pressure, I think is extremely beneficial. Now, Amanda, any final points?
Final points. Well, we have approximately, I think, 7 weeks to the OGT in March. And of course, I'm excited, and I know you guys are excited out there. I would just say that from now until the OGT or beyond the OGT, you don't want to just stop, drop instruction and focus on OGT. You actually want to, like the article suggests, provide assessment opportunities for students in the context of your instruction. You can refer back to the article and look at how you can incorporate it in the different stages of the learning cycle for ideas on that. But if anything, you want to make sure that the items or whatever assessment opportunities you provide students, they have the rigor and the cognitive demand that is comparable to the OGT.
Okay, words of wisdom. Thank you, Amanda and Karen, for participating and for this rich conversation and sharing your expertise with other science educators across the state.
Thank you for having us.
And thank you for your participation and email questions. In this webcast, we've discussed reasons for building a test bank of OGT-like items, suggested sources for OGT-like items, demonstrated a procedure for aligning items to the standards and cognitive demand, and underscored the importance of cognitive demand. We've just scratched the surface of these topics. Additional information and supporting materials can be found on the Science Instructional Strategies, A Look at the OGT, and that's found at www.ohioRC.org/4/science/OGT. If you'd like to learn more about these topics, please feel free to contact ORC at web@ohioRC.org. We would be happy to work collaboratively with you to plan building or district-wide professional development programs. For the Ohio Resource Center, I'm Terry Shiverdecker, wishing you success with all of your science instructional strategies.